Hello, folks. Back with ancient cosmography, and this is this is what the Celtic story, the Gaelic story of Diarmid versus the boar seems to represent. The Diarmid is the in the poem, or one of the poems about it calls him like the hawk. So I think because he has a face like a hawk, but a body of a man, because he likes always throwing these spears, and he throws the spear at Australia, the boar, which is this part right here. It bounces off, shatters into these three islands. That's all in the poem. Then he pulls the short sword from its sheath and kills the boar. Then he gets killed by the long poison bristle on the top of the boar's snout, which seems to be this warrior reef right here, which is actually right here, right between the two. But something else that is right between the two is the Torres Strait Islands. Like, there's a few islands like off the coast. You could see at least that one there, and there's some more there. So, because this same type of story, song, and art was used is used still today by the Australian Aborigines to navigate. So, anywhere they want to go, they have a song and with a story of like different animals and stuff fighting each other and doing different hijinks and whatever. And the story is based on the shapes of the land. So, there's like the lizard story, and so there's some mountain that's shaped like a lizard, and then maybe some other thing shaped like a lizard, so it goes along some area, so there'd be multiple iterations of the same characters. And that's the way that they can survive in conditions nobody else can, crossing the outback, because they have these songs, these mnemonics, these memorization devices. So this seems to be a Celtic version of that, just like the ancient Egyptians had spell songs to sail around the planet. The Celts did as well. Everybody sailed around the planet. It's so pathetic that people think that people honestly believe that Columbus was the first to sail, across the sea. I mean, come on. It literally requires no technology. So there's no reason to believe that he was the first one, other than just if you want to be gullible or whatever. It's like a totally implausible idea on its face that people had boats for tens of thousands of years, but somehow never used them until Christianity. It's stupid. Anyway. So anyway, he's the boar. This seems to be maybe a depiction of him as a boar from the earliest cave paintings in Sulawesi, which is just nearby here. It's right here or something. These are the oldest paintings in the world, on the planet, and I think this one depicts Australia as a boar, just as the Celts do. So I think the Celtic story is, at least parts of it are at least 45,000 years old, and probably much older. But other parts of it are new. They do remixes and samples and whatnot. And I think that this, that basically the snout, the pointy bit is that bit right there. Jinkara, or I forget what it's called, something like that. And the this indent, I think, is this indent right here. And this indent is probably this indent here. And these front legs are probably this one, I'm guessing, is like this kind of whole area here, and then this one would be like this, basically Coburg Peninsula right here, which helps form Van Diemen Gulf there. And then this, there's a distinct little kind of shape, little kind of not bigger than a dot, but a small shape right off the tip of this one, which would then be presumably the Tiwi Islands right there. And yeah, so and then, Papua is the Birdman. And of course, like, this is still to this day known as Bird's Head Peninsula, Bird's Beak Peninsula, Bird's Neck Isthmus. And reportedly it was named that by the explorers who, like, the European explorers, sailors who discovered it. So this means, because I'll show this to people and they'll be like, but how could they see what it looked like if they didn't have airplanes? And it's like, you guys know people had maps before airplanes, right? Like, they knew the shapes of things. Like, they, it's complicated. Almost nobody alive is smart enough to do it, but they did it. It's just by using the stars to map things out. But also small things like this. If you're on the top, if you're in the crow's nest of your boat or whatever, you can see a lot of these shapes, You certainly can see, this, you can see the spear, you can see the sword, you can see the bristle, and you can basically see the snout, because this is zoomed in. This part here, I zoomed in on the end of this Cape York Peninsula. So that's the part you're going to see the most when you're sailing through. And then, yes, you're going to see this face. It's not that, it is huge, but at least if you're in the crow's nest of your boat on a clear day, I think you will see a lot of this, especially as you're approaching, because the further something is, the lower it is due to the curvature of the earth. And so it's, so you can see it. It's not like some big mountainous thing that you can't see. So, but anyway, so I was convinced already that these ancient, songs, of course, and stories and art are navigational devices. But then I found out that the Australian Aborigines have the same thing still active, and that they're still using them to cross the outback. And so I was like, all right, that's cool. But like, every source on it only refers, or most of the, everything I had read on it only refers to crossing the land with it. And so it seemed like they had nothing about what I had been studying, which are oceanic spell songs to memorize, straits mostly. But anyway, so now I finally did find that, so that's good. It gets me one step closer. So they're called song lines, and the guy who coined that name for them, song lines, was an Englishman, and he believed that these are the key to understanding all ancient mythology, that all ancient mythology, just as I'm saying, it was, mnemonics, it was like memorization devices to navigate largely. I mean, there's other stuff too. There's songs for everything. But the central themes tend to be the songs about geography and the songs about astronomy, and generally the two are merged, or certainly they're often merged. Songlines, dreaming tracks, and Aboriginal mapping. Alan Stevenson, November 9th, 2022. Scottish surname. The idea of ley lines in Britain was promoted after the First World War by an amateur archaeologist, the English antiquarian Alfred Watkins, most notably in his book The Old Straight Track. He thought they were the legacy of pre-Roman inhabitants of Britain who worked out quite sensibly during a time when the English landscape was dense with forests and the shortest distance between 2 points was a straight line, and being tougher than modern Britons would tramp bravely through rivers and up hills to get to their destinations. Tracks were set out visually by lighting beacons on high points, for example, and then lining up markers and key points across the intervening land, including mounds and moats, stone circles, and more. Intersections acquired local significance, becoming meeting places and markets, then later burial mounds and temples. Recent evidence confirms that these significant places later became churches and even cities. The Irish have their ferry paths, now mainly tourist attractions dotted with picnic sites and make-believe grottos. So these ley lines and ferry paths may be the same as, the Aboriginal song lines on land, which often are pretty much straight lines. And so these ley lines and ferry tracks or whatever, ferry paths likely had songs and other art to accompany them and to illustrate them. The Irish have their ferry paths, now mainly tourist attractions dotted with picnic sites and make-believe grottos, but many Chinese people still believe in dragon lines and feng shui. The Incas used spirit lines or sikus or something with the Inca Temple of the Sun in Cusco as their hub, marking the routes with huacas, stone monuments that represent something revered. And so it's hard to know. This could also overlap with the measuring of the planet, because there's song lines, which are ways to travel, and then there are lines that were probably used to measure the planet, since people have been measuring it for thousands and thousands of years. Plato measured it, or Tosthenes measured it. That was the normal thing for ancient priests to do, use the rays of the sun to measure the diameter of the earth. So some of those lines, like from the solar temple, could be about that, but it could be both also. You could be using the same lines that you use to measure the earth to also travel. So, stone monuments that represent something revered. For the Aboriginal people of Australia, songlines, also called dreaming tracks, are paths across land and sky which mark the routes followed by localized creator beings. The paths are recorded in traditional songs, stories, dance, and painting. By singing these songs in sequences, Indigenous people can navigate the deserts of Australia's interior. One of the most common forms of representation in Australian Aboriginal culture is the map. Bark paintings. So yeah, that's the same as everything. That's the same as the Paleolithic. That's the same as the Egyptian. Everything is a map. Like almost all ancient art is maps. One of the most common forms of representation bark paintings are often maps, as are sand sculptures, body painting, and rock art. So rock art goes back to 45,000 years ago and largely unchanged. Spear throwers and log coffins may be decorated with maps. spear throwers, that's atlatls, the little thing you use to throw the spear. So log coffins, so that's the same as the Egyptians. They put their maps, the Book of Two Ways, their most important maps, inside coffins. Message sticks and toas, way markers, may incorporate geographical information. That's like the Egyptian wands, which had information about the cosmos on it. Songlines. For many thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have navigated their way across the lands and seas of Australia, using paths called by some songlines or dreaming tracks, but which have their own names in Indigenous languages. So here is where it's funny. I was actually skimming through this and I was like, oh, this looks cool, but I wish there was something about the sea. And I hadn't seen that part, that line where it says across lands and seas. So I separately Googled that, and then it took me to the same page, and I was like, oh, whoops, I guess I was already there. Because, this is the first thing that I've seen that actually mentions oceanic songlines, because almost all the other ones just say they're for crossing land. But the Torres Strait Islanders, of course, would use them for crossing water because they just have these little islands that they probably want to get around from one to the next. And so that's the same as the Egyptian, Book of Two Ways, and much of the Book of the Dead is the same type of songline for sailing. But there are also lands, like they're in the Book of Two Ways, the coffin texts of Middle Kingdom Egypt. There's like in the map that shows the area around Egypt, or no, in the map that shows Australia. That's true. It's the part that's Australia. I used to think it was Egypt based on me following the experts' misinterpretation of what Russet Jau means, because the experts say Russet Jau is Gaza or Giza, but actually it seems to be the Pacific Ocean. And but so it has a part in the Book of Two Ways that says the spells for crossing Russet Jau, the ways by sea and by land. So there's one section by sea and one by land. So that might incorporate some of the exact same song lines of the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. It's kind of arbitrary calling Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders because the Torres Strait Islanders are Aboriginal to the Torres Strait Islands, but somehow Aboriginal has just become cemented as the name just for Australian Aboriginal people. So it's, anyway, awkward nomenclature. But it just shows that they were doing the same thing as the Egyptians. And so the Torres Strait Islanders, they're right there. So they would be using their song lines to navigate around from this island to these other little islands, and then to Australia and maybe to Papua. And the fact is, their culture is extremely close to the Aborigines. For instance, they have the same songline system as the Aborigines, but it's also largely indistinguishable from the Papuans. And to be honest, it's in many ways indistinguishable from all ancient pre-Christian civilizations, and even from early Christians that understood the symbolism in the Bible, that some of which is geographical, some of which is astronomical. All right, well, my phone's probably going to cut me off in a minute, but I'll just read a little more. Trade was practiced between neighboring language groups as well as over vast distances between language groups of different environmental region. Stones, ochres, tools, ceremonial items, and other resources that were not normally